Hi, and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted to have Joel Snyder with us today. Joel has a long and glorious history of delivering audio description, and this is something that's really important to a large part of our audience. We've covered captioning before, but audio description enables people who are blind to really fully appreciate what's going on screen. So, Joel, can you tell us a bit about yourself, your journey to here, and how you got first involved in delivering audio description? Because I know you've done it for an awful lot of things.
Sure, I was one of the first audio describers in a formal sense, although in my book I talk about the history of audio description and people using description forever, since prehistoric times even. But I will take what you said there, Neil, for a second, understanding what is going on with a visual image. And I basically talk about audio description, allowing a person who's blind to understand, he points to his head, and appreciate, his hand is on his heart,
Hmm.
a visual image or a video or a film. It's in other words, it's not simply a brain thing, as in linear understanding something. It's also getting a mood or a feeling from it that sometimes is imparted only through images. So, but in answer to your question, I began, well, my background is in professional theater and media, radio, and but also education, that kind of thing. And in the 70s, I began as a volunteer reader for a radio reading service. Still have them here in the States, perhaps fewer of them now, but it was a way for folks who are blind, or folks who could not access print newspapers for whatever reason, could hear newspapers being read on the air, or magazines, novels. That was in 72. And in 1980, the group I worked with, the Washington Ear, which had been run by a woman named Margaret Fansteel, a blind woman, she was, long story short, basically she was approached by a major theater company in town here in Washington, D.C., Arena Stage, about the possibility of using the same equipment that they had just installed for assisted listening for folks who are hard of hearing. Could that equipment be used, somebody speaking into a microphone, to describe images in the pauses between bits and pieces of dialogue, and make the play accessible to people who are blind or have low vision? And Margaret thought, sure, that sounds like a great idea. Came back to the Ear, our little studio, pulled together about 4 or 5 of us. And as I say, I had a background in theater and media, voice, and as an English teacher too. So that's where we first began to hammer out some of the principles of audio description. That was in 81. And I should mention, this was being done almost simultaneously on the West Coast in San Francisco by a great guy named Gregory Fraser. He actually did a master's thesis on audio description, his idea for this, in the late 70s. So we didn't know each other until a little bit later. I got to be good friends with Gregory. So that's, so since 1981. I've been doing it, and now it has blossomed from theater to television, where it's mandated in any number of countries now for at least a minimal number of hours,
Sure.
cinema, DVDs, streaming video, but also all manner of live events. I've done live description of both of President Obama's inaugurations on ABC television. I've done description for weddings. I've done description for rodeos, for parades. I've done description for funerals. So wherever the visual image is important, a describer might be found.
Okay. Okay. Live funerals?
Yes, funerals, sure.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
were these big public ones, or do people just hire you for private?
No, the 2 I have done were private affairs. I mean, they're open to the public, certainly, like any funeral, but they were the funerals of people who are blind, who were real aficionados of description, and you just know they would have wanted blind colleagues who were at the service to know, what does the hall look like, what are the flowers like, what's the podium like, etc., that kind of thing. And so it works out. You know, it's not absolutely essential
No.
to experience the funeral, but because it's so much about words, but it added a nice touch.
I know Deborah's got a question.
Sure.
Yeah, Joel, you've got a great voice, so I can see
Thank you.
why this is a good fit for you. But how does this tie into what we see happening now with some of our movies that are having the descriptive language added?
Right. Well, thank you for the compliments, certainly. And actually, many people will say, oh, that person's a great actor. They've got a great voice. He'd be a good describer. Well, not necessarily so. And I speak as someone who's been in the acting union for 35 years. You know, actors are used to being in the limelight, in the spotlight. When you're describing on behalf of people who are listening and the art form being described. It's not about you. It's about enhancing the production. Description is really about writing. It's about the words. So, you know, perhaps somebody has a beautiful voice. They might be okay to voice the descriptions that have been written separately, but even there, a lot of the work I did in the 80s, a lot of radio commercials and such, that's great, but it's a whole different thing when you're voicing description. You need to be sensitive to, obviously you've got a script, you need to watch what's happening on screen so you can follow along. You're also following time code, and you're also listening for cues, so it's a much more complex process to voice description. But most often, it's two different things, two different people, the describer and then the voice talent. In performing arts, oftentimes it'll be the same.
So I'm guessing that when you're live, it's quite a challenge, because obviously you've got to try and understand when the next actor's coming in. You've got to think about what's going on the stage or
Right.
in the venue, and
Right.
get your description concise and over before someone else starts
Yes.
speaking again.
No, you're absolutely right, Neil. But you know, in preparing description for a play, or certainly a movie or a film, you know, in order to do a professional job, a good job, one needs to see it, preview it, and even have it on tape, so one could even develop a written script. Not so much that your face is in the script, especially live theater. Anything can happen on stage. I like to say you have one half an eye on the script because you know it so well, and still 1.5 eyes on the stage. So as far as true extemporaneous description, that usually only happens when a preview is simply not possible, like both of President Obama's inaugurations. I had an agenda, I had an outline, I knew who a lot of the speakers would be, I even had name pronunciations, but that's it. Otherwise, I'm watching and being sensitive to not only what's being spoken by President Obama or the First Lady. I was doing it for ABC television, so you had two commentators going, and they love to just sort of chat throughout. They're not describing, they're just offering their filling space with their voices, and so I had to kind of find pauses to get in a couple of words. That was tricky.
Antonio, I know you have a question.
Yes, it's based on the topic that you're talking is. Do you think that there's a need for the person that is doing that job to understand the audience and to make sure that, you know, if you are dealing with an audience from a certain age, from a certain generation, you can adequate the story to that same audience?
Yeah, I think that's right. But But keep in mind, we're dealing, for the most part, with mass media, and you simply don't know with any precision who's in your audience. Now, there are some exceptions. For instance, for 6 years, in fact, for the first time ever, Sesame Street was described for television, and I did it with my staff of people. There you know that the principal audience, 3 to 5 year old. So I was oftentimes telling my script writers, you know, hey, watch it with the 5-syllable words or whatever, because we have to be aware of the audience. But typically, we have a broad swath of people that are listening, all the way from folks who are simply low vision and can see if you tell them where to look, to people who are totally blind and even congenitally blind from birth. So it's hard to, you have to find that kind of middle ground, if you will, that will serve the needs of all the people along that spectrum.
So, how someone doing that type of job can have feedback from the audience? How do you actually know, oh, I'm actually doing a good job, people actually understanding and having a good perception about what the story is?
Well, every company that I've worked with, including my own, we develop an advisory group of people who are not only potential consumers of description, but who know description. They've listened to a lot of description, and they have a good sense of what is the best way to do it or not, and not just what they like. It's a matter of what is most appropriate, and there are guidelines, there are best practices that I go at length in my book to outline. So you get feedback that way. You get feedback in a number of ways. Certainly, description consumers let their voices be known on our audio description listservs. The networks that broadcast things will hear all kinds of commentary about, did the description work or not. Other describers are listening. In a live setting for performing arts, some describers will actually do a dress rehearsal with people there who are trusted consumers who know description, and they'll get feedback there. After a performance, when you've done description, it's possible, of course, to meet up with some of the folks who are listening. But when you're face to face with someone who is listening to your work, as well, how did I do? What are they going to say? They're going to say, oh, it was wonderful. Thank you so much. I saw everything. It was just wonderful. And it may not have been quite so wonderful. So, you know, there are different ways to get that feedback.
Okay. So I'm very interested with the sort of dilemma that both captioning and audio description face, which is the dilemma of this proliferation of user-generated content that we're seeing. There's masses and masses of rich media. Here at AXSChat, your description wouldn't take long. I mean, you could describe what we're doing quite easily. We're all static,
Right.
but we do caption all of our videos,
Right.
and that takes effort, and not everyone's going to go to that effort. So how do you see captioning not just captioning, but also audio description developing and coping with the increasing volume of media out there?
Well, with captioning, I think we're getting to a point where technology will take over. To some extent, people who do real-time captioning with a steno machine, they're probably not going to be used in the future for captioning because it's expensive. And now what is used is someone who's re-speaking sound into a Dragon box or something that will convert sound to text automatically. In the future, you'll have boxes in every television studio that can listen to any voice and put the text on the screen. Worked with the National Captioning Institute, so I know a little bit about captioning and how that may happen in the future. And for that, then, of course, you could have anybody's YouTube video be captioned with a machine that's listening to the sound and trying to turn that sound into words on a screen. Hasn't happened yet, at least
well, not very well.
Not well.
Because
That's
Google have enabled it with YouTube.
With description, it's a more difficult. And at this point, I don't trust any machine to tell me what should be described, what words should be used, how the vocalization should be made. However, I've worked very closely with a fellow a scientist in San Francisco, happens to be blind, Josh Mealy, and he's developed something. There are a couple of other initiatives like this. His is called YouDescribe, and it allows people to go on the web, find a video they like on YouTube or whatever, and post to this cloud, if you will, that he maintains, a description. And then you can search for that video and its description on the web, download the description, and play it with the video. So it's done by volunteers. It's done by, it's crowdsourced, essentially. Yeah. And I think as long as YouDescribe, and Josh knows I've hammered him over the head with this, as long as they at least make an effort to train people that are going to use the system in the basics of good description, then I think it makes a lot of sense and is really valuable. I oftentimes have said sometimes better no description than bad description. Bad description can annoy. It doesn't enhance, it detracts. And I've seen people who are blind in a theater audience pull the earbud out and say, I'll go without it because this is annoying. This doesn't help. So there are do's and don'ts. There are best practices, and they should be observed.
Before I hand over to Deborah, because I know she's got another question, sure. I just want to pick up on a couple of these points, because I think that you're right about the potential for captioning. I think the technology's on the cusp.
Right.
I see on the horizon, and it is on the far horizon, there's stuff happening already in terms of object recognition and so on, and that I think that computers are getting better all the time. You're not going to be out of a job anytime soon, but I think that there is potential for artificial intelligence to do a half-decent job within the next decade, possibly, of describing simple things, not complex interactions, not necessarily action scenes, but then describing objects in a room, maybe doing what Google are doing now, for instance, with YouTube, which is using the auto captioning as the basis for people to then crowdsource and build on top of.
Well, actually, Neil, it exists now. Yeah. There's an app. There's a couple of apps. There's one called TapTapC that allows a person to simply hold the camera on their phone at an object, and it will translate that visual image. It will say can of soup, or even what kind of soup. There are some apps that do that with live human beings, volunteers, who then could actually read the label to you and go into more detail.
I know a great tale about that, because I was at a conference with a chap who's a telecoms analyst who's visually impaired, and he'd been in Korea, and he was in a hotel, and he got there, and the aircon was turned to heating on full, and he couldn't work out how to do it. It was a digital interface, so he used the app to call up someone that could then use his mobile phone camera and turn the heating down to a comfortable temperature. So I thought it was brilliant. But yeah, these are sort of discrete things, and the complexity of describing a sort of a whole piece of video is a big leap forward.
That's something else. Yeah.
Deborah, I know I've spoken enough, so I know you've got another question.
No, it's a really very, very interesting. conversation. Joel, do you mind telling us a little bit more about your book, what the name of your book is, why you wrote it? We're starting to feature authors more on AXSChat, and we'd really like to know a lot more about your book. When was it published, and why? Why'd you write this book?
That's great. Thank you. Sure, I'm happy to plug my book. Yeah, but it was published in 2014, relatively recently, by the American Council of the Blind, and it's called The Visual Made Verbal, a comprehensive training manual and guide to the history and applications of audio description. So a search on just The Visual Made Verbal, people could find it easily. It's on Amazon. It's on Bookshare, which is a way for people who are blind to download it for free if they're a member of Bookshare. We've got our own, there's a website, thevisualmadeverbal.net. You can purchase it there. And, of course, you can purchase it from the American Council of the Blind through their website also. Basically, what I wanted to do is, to a certain extent, it is a outgrowth of my PhD dissertation, which I did with the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. I did it that way because there are no universities, there's next to none, really programs in this country that focus on audio description. I've taught some courses, but in Spain, in Germany, in the UK, there are full-blown master's degrees and doctorate level studies in audio description. So I worked with Pilar Orrero in Barcelona, who actually I trained in audio description some 15 years ago. But she's a translator and a specialist in audiovisual translation. So my dissertation was quite a bit larger, but the book is pulled from the dissertation, and like I say, gives a history. It talks about the different applications for description, and then gets into what are the best practices, what are the guidelines, drawn in large part from guidelines that exist all around the world, and they're all very much the same. And then finally, another twist of the book is that you can go to certain exercises and actually the book gives you a password, a username and a password that lets you go to a website where you can see a video, you can work on describing it, then you can watch it as it was described professionally, that sort of thing. So there are good 50-some exercises like that on a dedicated website.
Okay. Cool, cool.
So, yeah. Available at fine bookstores near you.
Well, we will add that. We're going to add that to AXSChat because
Thank you.
We keep it running. We add our questions and profiles of our guests, but we also will provide links so that anyone watching today and in the future can just click on the link and get access to the book. So
that's
thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Deborah.
So without wanting to diminish sales of said book, can you tell us some of the basic points people should know if they were wanting to contribute to crowdsourced audio description? What are the key things people should be doing?
Well, it comes down to an essay that I wrote quite some number of years ago, simply called The Fundamentals of Audio Description, and I try to codify training within these four fundamentals. First and foremost, observation. You can't describe anything that you haven't really seen. And I don't mean simply see, I mean observe. Really understand the image all around that image, all the image itself, its context, etc. Truly notice what we all see in front of us, but most sighted people, they see, but they don't observe. They don't truly notice. A describer can't afford to go through life that way. We must see with exactitude, as Goethe said. So I have a number of other quotes throughout the book. Observation, and then ironically, you've observed everything. The second fundamental is editing. you're going to dispose of most of what you've observed, because description is about zeroing in on the essence of what we see. There's no way we can describe everything in just one image. A painting, perhaps, gets more complicated with moving images. No, we have to let go of a good deal of information in order to understand, develop some visual intelligence, if you will, with respect to movies and plays and theater, and provide for the listener what's most critical to that understanding and appreciation. And then the third fundamental is language. It's all about words, as I mentioned with Deborah earlier. You need to develop your vocabulary. You need to understand word techniques, the techniques that writers use, poets use, alliteration, onomatopoeia. You need to understand those techniques in order to, with as few words as possible, again, editing, convey the visual image. It's like what Blaise Pascal said years and years ago in writing a letter to a friend. He said, "I've only made this letter longer because I've not had the time to make it shorter." That's key to audio description. And then finally, vocal skills. In performing arts in particular, one who develops the description usually is the one who's voicing it. That doesn't happen often in media, film, television, DVDs, but you need to develop an awareness of how the voice makes meaning, and that's quite critical to the whole thing as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent points. Excellent
Yeah.
points.
Antonio, you had a question.
No, no, over the past few years, we've seen more and more people using technology, using social media to communicate. We see a huge number of applications being developed, every day. And where do you see all this going? How can we make sure that that people have awareness about the importance of using technology to improve the experience of the users?
Yeah, actually, I'm very glad you asked that, because we are on the cusp of changing the way audio description is accessed. I'm speaking about apps that can listen to a movie, a play, a DVD in your living room, and automatically sync to what it's listening an audio description track or an alternate language. There's a company I've been doing some work with in Los Angeles called Theater Ears. It works on that principle. The app itself is something you download to your phone for free, but then let's say you're a Spanish-speaking person. There's some 40 million Spanish speakers in the United States, and you really speak only Spanish, but your whole family is going to go see the new Star Wars movie, and it's playing in English. Duh, right there at your movie theater in Los Angeles or wherever. Well, theoretically, you could have that Theater Ears app on your smartphone, download the Spanish dub for the Star Wars The Force Awakens, and while your family's sitting right there with you, they're hearing it in English, you've got your earbud in, hearing it in Spanish, or with a headset, however you want to do it. But that's how I think Theater Ears is probably going to be most popular and make money on it, so it's able to exist. But in addition, same thing with audio description. No more of this having to get a unit from the movie theater and the ushers don't know how to work it, and it's not charged and all of that. No, you'll have downloaded it at home before you go to the movie theater or before you turn on a DVD at home. And by the way, Theater Ears has a function available whereby the sound of the movie it's listening to can be enhanced and boosted, but most importantly, equalized, enhanced. The problem with understanding hearing sound so often by people who are hard of hearing is not that it's not loud enough, it's that it's not clear enough. And that function on their app goes another huge step forward towards helping with folks who are hard of hearing. So, Antonio, I think that's the next big thing with respect to audio description and technology.
Okay, thank you so much for that.
Sure.
So that leads me on to a question, because one of the things I'm always interested in is how we ensure that there's interoperability, because lots of people invent stuff and then you end up with this fragmented ecosystem. Are there any standards for any of this stuff yet, or is that something that needs to be thrashed out?
Well, the standards for the development of the audio description, the writing, that's fairly well established, as I say in my book, and different countries have different standards. They're all fairly similar, you know, having been developed since the late 80s and 90s, probably for the first time in the UK. The UK by far has more description than any other country. It has eclipsed a long time ago the United States, even though we began developing it. As far as technical standards, that is, you know, I'm not the best person to ask there, but I do sit on several FCC, Federal Communications Commission panels that discusses this. In other words, the way description is transmitted in the UK is not the same as it is in the US, even though we're both on digital platforms now. If there could be more standardization between countries, I think that would go a long way towards helping the future of audio description. Indeed, it used to be that captions in movie theaters, you had to insert a mirror device in your coffee cup, the cup holder, and the captions were being scrolled in the backwards. You looked in the mirror and saw it frontwards, if you will. Mm-hmm. But we've eclipsed that with other ways to deliver captions, some of which is simply having open captioned screenings for people who are deaf. But I think with description as well, that standardization, for instance, in most countries, it's available. There's available only one alternate audio track. So that's a bit of a problem in the United States. You've got the regular sound coming. A person at home who wants to hear that sports event in Spanish can click the SAP button and get it in Spanish, unless it's being described, and vice versa. Only one secondary audio track, and I get real frustrated with that. I think in a digital platform, we should be able to deliver 3 or 4 audio tracks. So it's not a matter of choosing between people that need different accommodations.
Yeah, I think that will come.
Yeah.
I do quite a bit of work with the BBC. They're a client, and we get to play around with some of their toys sometimes.
Right.
And one of the things that they were showing about 18 months back was the ability to use prismatic presentation. So you could have 2 people sat on the sofa,
right,
watching different programs on the same screen.
Right.
So it's a question of configuration. It's all doable. The technology's there. And of course, you'd have to be able to have separate audio for the separate programs, because one might be watching Dancing with the Stars and another might be watching the motor racing. So.
This also applies, by the way, to museums. Museums are a little bit late coming to the use of audio description, but it's burgeoning now in the United States, certainly, and in the UK and in other countries. Museums are now finding that they've got an untapped audience. People who are blind didn't go to museums. You couldn't touch anything. There was no audio description. Well, now they're doing, museums increasingly are doing far more with touch carts, having items that can be touched that are just like the item being looked at, having audio description on recorded tours, and that makes the whole space accessible to a great extent. So I'm very interested in what's going on there too.
Excellent. Deborah, do you have a final question?
No, to be honest, the point I was going to make, y'all just made it, and so I mean, I'm just really, I'm with you. I'm just really excited, Joel, about the future, and I love that everything that's happening with audio description continues to make the point that we say all the time. Things are created. Maybe they're created initially for people with disabilities, and it winds up adding value to all of society.
Absolutely.
And so every single thing we do with this, it's improving society as a whole, and that's just such a win. So
I make that point so often in my trainings around the world. Description is for folks who are blind and sighted folks who are in the kitchen making a sandwich while the TV's on in the living room. You don't miss a beat.
Right. I agree. I agree.
Plus,
it's good for all of us.
It's another kind of audio movie. If you take the audio of a film with audio description, well, you can listen to it in your car for hours or while you're jogging or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, also, Joel, I just want to say this one thing. Being a woman of a certain age, the audio description has actually helped me understand movies better. I got audio description for The Matrix, and I was like, oh, I didn't know red played into that. There's something I just don't understand. Exactly. And the audio description helps me comprehend the nuances or the entire movie in some cases.
That's right, because you know those sighted people, those sighted people, they're the folks that are dependent on light. They have that disability. They have to have light. You know, they don't.
That's right.
Again, they don't. They see perhaps, but they just don't observe. They don't notice. So they need description too.
So I think
I need it.
I think what you're saying is we absorb, but we don't observe.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's an immersive experience. We're just there with the popcorn and the cake and the sort of big gulp bucket of fizzy pop. And so yeah, we go for the immersive experience. We're not paying too much attention.
Yeah. It's all a little superficial, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating half hour.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Right. We look forward to you joining us on Twitter later on.
Absolutely.
Okay. Please don't disconnect.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. We'll develop our 6 questions, I guess.